Hello. My name is hopefully you can see that. Sorry. My name is Sarah Floyd, and this is my senior exposition. And I chose a topic that connected to a couple different things that I do for work. Obviously, I'm interested in psychology and being a psychology professor, and I'm doing a psychology capstone. But I also wanted to pick something that was applicable to teaching and to coaching. And something that I talk about a lot is healthy sleep patterns with my athletes and my students, and how it helps with memory retention and all of these other things. But to be honest, it was more of me assuming this information, not knowing it. So that is my overarching topic, and we're going to kind of focus on the short-term effects. There is some information in my presentation about how poor sleeping habits can lead to Alzheimer's and things of that nature, but for the sake of being concise, we're going to say mainly for the short term. And here are the main cognitive and emotional elements of the presentation. The first is judgment, and how our decision-making skills may alter or not based on our sleeping patterns. Our memory is probably the biggest one within my presentation. It has the most backed research. Attention and regulation, specifically regulation with our emotions, adaptability, genetic susceptibility, time extent, like 8 hours versus 12 hours for how many days, months, years. Functional connectivity is what I'm mainly focusing on, like the neurology side of what parts of the brain are firing and are they consistently firing in those areas whenever we are getting consistent sleep versus SD sleep deprivation. And then our creativity. And here is kind of where all of this research stems from. So actually in the first century is where Rhetorician Quintilian made this claim that the interval of a single night will greatly increase the strength of memory. He obviously did not have the same resources that we have today. But what he said was absolutely true and now backed by some pretty sound science. And then we have Alcmanium. He was around in 450 BC, and he was actually a physician. And his claim was that sleep's purpose was basically for bodily regulation, and that blood flow was different in wakefulness and sleep, and that all of the blood, or not all of the blood, but most of blood circulation would go on in the body, not in the brain during sleep. So it was like this state of unconsciousness was his idea. And then we go to Herman, who actually had the ability to test some of these ideas. And his test subject and methodology was based on himself. And what he would do is he would come up with a sequence of like nonsensical letters like ADH or whatever. That's not nonsensical, ADHD. But just like letters that are nonsensical, he would memorize them and then kind of record the duration of time that he could retest successfully with that information. And there were a lot of variables that he tried to control and then found difficulty controlling, that he directed correlation to. The correlation was stress and sleep mostly, and repetition. And then one of the variables that is mentioned here is the whole nonsensical methodology came from the pre-knowledge that our brains have, a webbing of neurons that, if fired with a new concept, will help that new concept stick within our brains. The idea like neurons that fire together, wire together. And so there is a likely chance that if he memorized actual ideas, that his mind, especially at his age when he did this, that his mind would have like a pre-connection to an idea that would help him remember it, and that would create more variable. And then this dude on my bottom right, they did the exact same thing, but instead of doing it on themselves, they did it on a population, and they would basically give these nonsense syllables, and then they would give like an interval of retention that they recorded, and then they would have the recall tests. And important to note, let's go back. Important to note that they actually found in this study that after a good night of rest and a not good night of rest had significantly different results and correlated pretty heavily. Bad night of rest, bad or worse results, and then good night of rest, good results and retention. So here are some of the theories. There's 4, there's only 3 here, but we'll get to the next one in a second. So we have the inactivity theory, and this is kind of like a like a Stone Age, like caveman age-esque idea where fundamentally humans are inactive at night because of safety, because the dark is dark and scary, and because we need to conserve energy, which we'll also talk about later. And then it minimizes like vulnerability to predators at night. That's an activity in a sense. The next one that we have is restoration theory. This primarily involves how sleep serves to repair and restore the body and mind. And there's also obviously different levels of sleep that serve the mind and brain different purposes. And then we get to energy conservation. So we have a couple of things working together. So the output is our decision making. And then we have the HCRT, which is kind of responsible for most of our like wakefulness. Like it's in our prefrontal cortex, and it's, decision making and things like that. And then in between, we have like our basic needs and functions, like moving our body, regulating our heart rate, food intake, things like that. And then MCH is the part of the brain that fires REM sleep. And so input all of these variables on the top, and that makes our decisions based on how much sleep we've gotten. And there's kind of like a connection being made here. I guess the best example I know how to describe it would be me personally. Whenever I am sleep deprived, I have a tendency to eat significantly less. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I need less food or nourishment. I probably need more. But there's kind of a disconnect and firing, because in order to meet the needs of my body and regulate my homeostasis, sleep is necessary. And so my decision making, even subconsciously, is different. Heart rates, blood pressure, things of that nature can all be different based upon our homeostasis. And the next one has to do with brain plasticity, and there is a lot going on here. We're looking at synapses connections. And on the left, this research was done during like an actual experiment or experience. There's actually 2 experiences going on. Sorry, there's a dog barking in the background. And how we are taking in initial information and experiencing it. There's like these negative and positive tags. Research doesn't know exactly what they do yet, but because our brains are wired electronically mostly, that there's like a negative and positive electrons going on connecting these synapses. But most of our brain runs on chemical synapses. So on the left, we have experiencing a memory, or, being in the moment. And then on the right, we actually have how the structure will solidify itself overnight. So our memory linkage, our experiences, our structure of plasticity will stabilize with good rest. So essentially, our brain will take information in, make connections with it based on our input, and then they will reform themselves or restabilize themselves to be effectively recalled later. And this process, as shown here, solidifies it when we have consistent and healthy sleep patterns. So this first study took several thousand people actually in the UK and did a study on their sleep patterns, and it was all like voluntary, surveyed information. There was no like brain wave activity tracking. There was no like, you know, therapy, intake or anything like that. It was really just an electronic survey that these people would document on the touchscreen. And they would also make like verbal interviews, recordings, and things of that nature. And most of them were college students. And we see two different things going on. Number one, that their survival probability was significantly less over the course of the years, obviously, because none of us are like eternal beings. But having healthy sleep patterns had a more positive curve on both the genetic risk side and just the survival probability in general. And this was one of the bigger studies, and there were a bunch of different subgroups here, but we are just going to talk about the main groups, which were the younger and the older males, which was primarily studied. There was women. There were differences between men and women, but for the sake of keeping things concise, this is what most of the research looks like. And some things to punctuate on. When we're talking about neuroplasticity, we're talking about reforming or resolidifying connections in the brain, basically reworking how our brain is intaking information and how the building blocks of our mind are working. And so at a younger age, actually before the age of 5, we are more likely, or we have a higher brain plasticity. We're able to learn things more quickly and apply them. There's less information clutter in here, and our connections are solidified quicker. And the only difference because of that is the older group, the only thing that they were better at was retention. And the general consensus was because if we have a bigger web of like schema or a bigger web of neurons that have the potential to fire with new neurons, then retaining information is easier, but that doesn't necessarily make it easier to learn. So the plasticity in the younger groups were better, but their retention was less. And then the older group, their plasticity was less, but their retention was better. And their sleep patterns were significantly different. And basically, this entire study was to kind of find a correlation between brain firing and structural advancements in the mind and linking them to sleep patterns. So a general consensus from this would be that the better the sleep patterns and deep sleep, the better our brain is able to rework itself and rebuild itself and to learn new things. While in the older groups, we're seeing that they're getting worse sleep. And so they're connecting that with the inability to be more flexible with their brain plasticity. And here are some other interesting things that sleep and sleep deprivation had on the impact of like our brain connectivity. So we have the prefrontal cortex. That's what the PFC stands for, and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex is like decision making, personality, that sort of thing. And then the amygdala is responsible for our emotional responses primarily. And we're seeing that there's a significant lack of consistency and connectivity between those two parts of the brain whenever sleep deprivation is present, meaning that we are not able to consistently regulate emotions or complete, problem solving tasks or understanding or learning or things of that nature, any connectivity between those two parts of the brain is firing very differently. So specifically, if this is going on, we have this thing called global signal variability, and sleep deprivation is associated with increased global signal variability, which means that there's like essentially a lack of coordination in the brain. We see that there's consistent firing on this B image on the bottom, and then we see inconsistent firing on the left where the sleep deprivation is present. So, what is the application? There's quite a few in my own personal perspective. And the first one would be mental health and therapeutic interventions. If we are literally incapable of firing specific brain functions correctly or normally just because of a sleep pattern, um, it is concerning that that is not looked at quite often in therapy and things like that, or even taken into account whenever we're assigning medications and things of that nature. It very well may be that stress and sleep deprivation or, insomnia, snoring, the difference between like REM sleep and barely sleeping and being able to rebuild those connections and rejuvenate the body and the mind, and being able to go through emotional regulations in the mind and being able to take memories and functionally like process them overnight, could be a huge tool in therapy. And it could be a huge thing to make sure that we're looking at. Because if the entire, mishaps and misfirings is due to something simple like a sleep pattern that is easily medicated or easily solved in most cases, then there may be a chance of less overkill when it comes to medical treatment. Then there's the education and academic performance. A lot of these studies were done on college students, and it's because they're just wildly known for not having consistent sleep patterns. And they're also usually connected to making poor decisions. Um, and I think that there's a correlation there. And if this was more wildly like informed, or if this was taken into consideration for medical students and things of that nature, I think that they would perform better. And we see that in places like Sweden, where they have, less school work at home and they are going to school for less hours. They actually have better test scores, or like Finland also does the same thing. And then we have workplace productivity. If people are struggling to have that connection between their amygdala and their prefrontal cortex and the communication between both, decision making and rationality is probably going to be a lot lower. So, application to people that are in the workforce, maybe your coworker isn't as frustrating as you think they are. Maybe you just worked 80 hours a week and got no sleep. Like, there might be some insight there. And then the cognitive health and aging, there is like no cure for things like Alzheimer's and other conditions that have to do with memory retention. And a lot of the studies kind of had a subsection where they noticed that participants that had poor sleep patterns had a higher likelihood of genetically and non-genetically, to kind of evolve into those conditions. Like, here, let me go back. This was one of the studies specifically where they talked about Alzheimer's, and how there was a higher risk or likelihood of Alzheimer's for people that were not getting consistent sleep. And if we can predetermine that, or we can predispose people to the effect that it has, then there might be a good chance that we have like a pathway into solving not necessarily curing, but just an extra conversation that has not been wildly expressed. And then we have the ethics conversation. The first one is genetics, snoring, insomnia, um, like trauma to the brain, things of that nature. They're not controllable. There are things that people can do to aid them. But as far as like equality, equity, and access, some people just have an easier or a harder time sleeping and getting into, deep sleep states where they can achieve, um, that reworking of the synapses and reformulating or strengthening. That's the word I'm looking for. Strengthening, memory retention. And there's um, kind of like a genetic component there. Then we have like economic. Not everybody, like for me, for example, I work 4 jobs and I don't have like financial support from anyone. And so, like, economically, it's not super realistic for me to be able to get the amount of sleep that I need all the time in order to accomplish all of the things in this presentation, all of the positive benefits. Because there are lots of people like me that are working themselves to death and also are immensely stressed. And those are really components that are not controllable for some groups. The other is environment. There are some elements of the environment that affect sleep, like if you live in a high trafficked area, or if your partner snores, or things of that nature that prohibit them from entering deep sleep. I mean, if those things are consistently bothering, and there's not really a solution for them, then, like, again, the equality or the access of good sleep is not obtainable for those audiences. Then we have the mental disorders. Their insomnia is associated or comorbid with lots of things. Um, ADHD, for example, that I struggle with that, being able to turn off the brain, any kind of paranoia, um, any kind of like comorbid mental disorders connecting to insomnia would be another issue of ethics, where there would need to be a financial element of helping those people overcome that kind of illness or to treat that kind of illness. And then there would also be the other hand of educating and allowing access to those kinds of resources to solve or treat the mental disorder. And then sleep patterns. This goes back to genetics. Some people have a tendency, it looked like, to not have deeper sleep or to have deeper sleep. And then also throughout your life, as we see in this study, that once you get older, your sleeping patterns are more irregular, and your brain's connectivity and activity and all of those things are just less. And the hours of sleep at night are different, and less. So if that's regular across a giant population of people, age might have to do with how equally we cannot achieve um, that whole sleep regulation. And then field reflection. I Throughout my entire DCC career, I did not hear a lot about how sleep was being integrated into other types of research, and cross-disciplinary collaboration would with sleep would probably make a huge difference, especially in diagnoses and intake and therapy and things of that nature. If we were, also going to the next part of the integration of sleep metrics, um, if emotional regulation, if comprehension, if memory retention, if decision making, if creativity, all of those things are affected by sleep, and people are diagnosed based on those symptoms rather than being told that they need to get better quality sleep. There may not even be a diagnosable issue, or maybe not one that is so severe that it needs to be diagnosed with good sleep. And so whenever they're also doing research for specific illnesses or mental disorders, taking into account their sleep patterns could make the difference in variation between two subjects, one that's performing differently or better, and another that's performing worse, based on sleep patterns, is just not commonly taken into account. Um, so applying this into other fields of research, especially psychology, could be beneficial. And yeah, that is the end of my presentation. It was fun.